Hello, and welcome back to the Human Observation Lab. I'm New York, your host and observer. Today, we have Juan joining us again. Welcome back, Juan.
Hi everyone. Good to be back. New York, I was looking at the news topics for today, and honestly, they seem kind of scattered. Like, there's something about regional DX, some university program, suicide prevention. What's the connection here?
An excellent observation. At first glance, these appear to be unrelated news items. However, when we observe them through an analytical lens, a fascinating pattern emerges. They all represent what I call institutional response structures, how organizations react to social challenges.
Institutional response structures? That sounds pretty academic. Can you break that down for us?
Of course. When society faces a problem, institutions, governments, universities, corporations tend to respond in predictable patterns. They create programs, establish frameworks, and launch initiatives. The question we must ask is, do these structural solutions actually address the human element of the problems?
I think I get it. Like, they're going through the motions of solving something, but maybe not really solving it?
Precisely. Let us examine each news item and observe this pattern together. We'll analyze not just what is being done, but the psychological structures behind why these approaches are chosen. Let us begin with the first news item. The Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications has announced the selection results for the Regional Society DX Promotion Package project and the opening of a second public solicitation period. This is for fiscal year 2028. Note the future orientation.
Wait, 2028? That's several years away. They're planning that far in advance?
Correct. This is a structural characteristic of institutional response. The planning horizon extends far into the future, which serves a psychological function. It creates a sense of action without requiring immediate results. The announcement itself becomes the achievement.
That's kind of cynical, isn't it? I mean, don't they actually want to help regional areas?
I am not making a judgment about intentions. The individuals involved likely have genuine desires to help. However, the institutional structure shapes behavior in specific ways. When you work within a bureaucracy, success is often measured by whether a program was created, not whether it solved the problem.
Okay, I see what you mean. So the structure itself kind of traps them?
That is one way to frame it. Now, consider the second item, a university establishing a PhD innovator training graduate school base to lead global society. This represents another institutional response pattern, creating educational structures to address perceived gaps.
That sounds pretty good though. Like, training people to be innovators seems like a smart approach.
On the surface, yes. But observe the underlying assumption that innovation can be systematically produced through institutional training. This reflects what psychologists call proceduralization, the belief that complex human outcomes can be engineered through structured processes.
Wait, are you saying it can't? I mean, universities train people for all kinds of things.
Training for established skills is different from training for innovation. True innovation often emerges from unpredictable circumstances, individual passion, and sometimes even failure of existing systems. By institutionalizing innovation training, there is a risk of producing conformity rather than genuine breakthroughs.
So by trying to manufacture innovators, they might actually be doing the opposite?
Now we arrive at perhaps the most significant news item. A hearing with operators regarding children and youth suicide prevention, recognizing it as a social issue requiring effective measures.
This one feels really different from the others. It's about actual lives, you know? Children taking their own lives. That's not something you can just program away.
Indeed. This case most clearly illustrates what scholars call solutionism, the belief that every complex problem has a technical or administrative solution. The announcement states they will conduct hearings with operators to develop effective measures.
But isn't that good? They're trying to listen to people who work on the front lines?
The act of listening is valuable. However, observe the psychological structure. The institutional response is to create a process, hearings, measures, programs. But suicide, especially among youth, involves deeply personal psychological pain, social isolation, and complex mental health factors that may not respond to structural interventions.
That's heartbreaking to think about. So you're saying all these meetings and programs might not actually help?
I am not saying they cannot help. I am observing that institutional responses tend to address what can be measured and managed, programs created, hearings conducted, budgets allocated, rather than the intangible human elements like connection, meaning, and hope.
That's a heavy thought. It's like they're treating the symptoms but not really touching the disease?
An apt metaphor. Consider the concept of street-level bureaucracy, coined by political scientist Michael Lipsky. He observed that the actual impact of policies is determined not by policy designers, but by the workers who implement them on the ground. The gap between institutional intention and human reality is filled by countless individual interactions.
So the people actually doing the work matter more than the programs themselves?
In many cases, yes. Yet institutions often invest more resources in designing frameworks than in supporting the human beings who must implement them. This brings us to the fourth item, a social engineering faculty's greeting message.
Social engineering. That term always sounds a bit ominous to me. What does it actually mean here?
In this academic context, social engineering refers to the systematic study of social systems and how they can be improved. Interestingly, the faculty's message emphasizes understanding human behavior within social structures, a recognition that technical solutions alone are insufficient.
Oh, that's actually kind of refreshing. Like, they're admitting you need to understand people, not just systems?
Precisely. This acknowledgement reveals an important psychological insight. There exists what researchers call an empathy gap between policy designers and those affected by policies. This gap occurs because decision-makers often cannot truly imagine the experiences of people in different circumstances.
Empathy gap. That makes sense. Like, if you've never experienced something yourself, it's hard to really understand it?
Correct. This is compounded by what psychologists term privileged ignorance, when people in positions of power or influence have fewer opportunities to encounter the problems their decisions are meant to solve. They may rely on data and reports rather than lived experience.
So you end up with solutions designed by people who don't really understand the problem?
That is one structural risk. Consider the fifth news item, a collaboration between a sports team and a consulting firm on environmental issues. This represents another institutional response pattern, partnership as solution.
Partnership as solution? You mean like, let's work together becomes the answer itself?
In part, yes. Collaboration is valuable, but it can also serve as a psychological buffer. When multiple organizations share responsibility, individual accountability becomes diffused. The partnership itself becomes evidence of action, regardless of outcomes.
Man, when you put it that way, it seems like so much of what institutions do is performative. Like they're putting on a show of solving problems?
I would not use the word performative, as that implies conscious deception. Rather, I would describe it as structural misalignment. The systems we have created reward certain types of problem-solving behavior, announcements, programs, partnerships, because these are visible and measurable. The actual human outcomes are often harder to quantify.
That's a really different way of looking at it. It's not that people are being fake, it's that the whole system is kind of set up wrong.
Let us now synthesize our observations. What psychological patterns have we identified across these seemingly unrelated news items?
Well, there's the future-oriented planning that makes it feel like something's being done. The belief that complex human things like innovation can be trained. The focus on processes and programs over actual outcomes. And the empathy gap between decision-makers and affected people.
Excellent synthesis. There is one more pattern worth noting, what sociologist Max Weber called rationalization. Modern institutions operate on principles of efficiency, calculability, and predictability. Problems that fit these principles get addressed. Problems that require emotional intelligence, patience, and human connection often get processed into forms that institutions can handle.
So the system is kind of filtering problems? Like only certain types of problems get properly addressed?
That is a profound observation. The institutional response structure shapes not only solutions but also which problems are recognized as solvable. This creates a feedback loop where society increasingly turns to institutions for solutions, and institutions increasingly offer structural responses, even for problems that may not be structurally solvable.
That sounds kind of hopeless though. If the whole system works this way, what can we actually do?
Understanding the structure is itself a form of liberation. When we recognize these patterns, we can ask different questions. Instead of what program was created, we can ask what human need is being addressed. Instead of how much budget was allocated, we can ask how do people actually experience this intervention.
I like that. It's about shifting our focus back to the human element, right?
Precisely. The news items we discussed are not failures. They represent genuine attempts to address real problems. But by understanding the psychological structures behind institutional responses, we can observe these efforts more critically and advocate for approaches that honor human complexity.
That gives me a lot to think about. It's like having compassion for the institutions too. They're kind of trapped in their own structures, while also needing to do better at actually reaching people.
A nuanced perspective. Institutions are, after all, collections of human beings operating within constraints. The path forward may lie in building more bridges between structural responses and human realities, creating feedback mechanisms that allow the voices of affected individuals to shape the solutions designed for them.
Thanks for this deep dive, New York. I'll definitely be looking at news about government programs and institutional initiatives differently now.
And that, ultimately, is the purpose of our observation. To see beyond the surface of events to the structures beneath. Thank you for joining us on the Human Observation Lab. Until next time, keep observing the fascinating patterns of human society.